On the night of June 13, 1876, in the twisted hills of Natchez, Mississippi, something happened that the history books will never tell you about. 47 enslaved souls rose from decades of unspeakable torture and unleashed a vengeance so calculated, so merciless that it left 4 overseers dismembered and a plantation master begging for mercy he had never shown. But here's what will shock you. This wasn't mindless violence. This was justice with a plan, executed by people who had been pushed so far beyond human endurance that they became something the world had never seen before. Freedom fighters who understood that sometimes liberty can only be written in blood. The stench in the quarters was unlike anything you could imagine. Not just the smell of unwashed bodies or rotting wood, but something deeper. The odor of trauma that had seeped into everything. Burnt skin, damp timber, chains that seemed to hum with malevolent energy. The very dirt beneath their feet had absorbed so much suffering that it had developed a memory of its own. And lately, that memory had begun to speak. Before we begin tonight's story, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life stories. Isaac Freeman understood this language of pain better than most. Every evening, as the sun bled red across the Mississippi sky, he would position himself on the same weathered stone, just steps away from the whipping post that had claimed so many. He didn't sit there because he enjoyed the view of suffering. He sat there because from that vantage point he could see everything. Every limping figure, every furtive glance, every whispered conversation that people thought the darkness would swallow. But Isaac didn't just watch. He listened with the intensity of a man whose survival depended on hearing what others missed. He heard the subtle clink of chains before they moved, the whistle of the whip slicing through air before it found flesh, and most haunting of all, he still heard his wife's screams echoing from that terrible day 3 years ago when they dragged her away, selling her to a plantation deep in Louisiana. "The earth's talking again," old Elias whispered, his milky eyes reflecting nothing but somehow seeing everything. The ancient man sat hunched in the shadows, fingers working over a string of beads carved from animal bones. "She's saying it's time." Isaac's hand instinctively moved to the rusted iron spike he kept hidden in his straw bedding. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it would serve its purpose when the moment came, and Isaac knew that moment was rushing toward them like a storm that had been building for decades. The signs had been impossible to ignore. Weeks had passed since the last human cargo had disappeared down the river, sold to feed the insatiable hunger of plantations further south. Colonel Horace Whitmore, the lord of this particular hell, had blamed his property for the financial losses. "Lazy, thieving, worthless," he'd snarled, his alcohol-reddened face twisted with rage. Reuben, the most vicious of the overseers, had made sure that 3 men paid the price with flesh stripped from their backs. One of them, a gentle soul named Thomas who had never raised his voice above a whisper, hadn't survived the lesson. No marker, no ceremony, just another body to be planted in unmarked ground. But when Isaac dug that grave, he witnessed something that chilled him, a root pushing up through the earth like a skeletal finger, as if the dead man was trying to claw his way back to demand justice. That's when Isaac knew old Elias was right. The earth had indeed started whispering, and its message was crystal clear. Vengeance was coming. In the belly of the quarters, where the walls absorbed secrets like blood, 47 figures materialized from the darkness. These weren't dreamers clinging to hope. These were people who had already died inside and been reborn as something harder than iron. They moved with the quiet purpose of those who had nothing left to lose because everything had already been taken from them. Clara stepped forward first, and if you saw her, you'd understand why grown men followed her without question. At 25, she carried more accumulated grief than most people could bear in a lifetime. Her baby sister had been sold at age 6, torn from Clara's arms while the child screamed for the only mother she had ever known. Her husband had been hanged for the crime of making eye contact with a white woman. But Clara's back had never bowed, her hands had never trembled, and her eyes burned with something that made even hardened overseers look away. 3 months, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. "That's what we need to make this perfect." Isaac nodded, feeling the weight of leadership settle on his shoulders. "No running," he added, his words cutting through the thick air like a blade. "No begging for better treatment. We take it. We take it all." "But how?" whispered Josie, a young man whose left arm bore permanent scars from accidents involving boiling sugar. Isaac's eyes swept the gathered faces, each one marked by suffering but blazing with determination. When he spoke, his words carried the finality of a death sentence, the same way they did us. Bone for bone, mark for mark, scream for scream. Over the following weeks, their plan took shape with the precision of a master craftsman. Josie became their eyes and ears, studying the patterns of their oppressors. When did they drink? When did they let their guard down? When were they most vulnerable? Abner, who handled the livestock, began hiding weapons in the most unlikely places. Rusty, blades wrapped in cloth and buried in manure piles. Clara and the women who worked in the kitchen discovered that certain roots, when ground fine and mixed into molasses bread, could slow a man's heart and cloud his thoughts without killing him immediately. And old Elias, he became their prophet. prophet, sitting motionless in his corner but somehow knowing everything that happened within miles of the plantation. He claimed the spirits of the dead whispered to him, and Isaac believed every word. The first one, Isaac declared with the solemnity of a judge pronouncing sentence, dies exactly like he lived, swinging that whip. That night, as they sat around their secret fire, Elias posed a question that made Isaac's blood freeze. You ever hear a chain scream when it breaks? The Mississippi sun at midday hit like a physical blow, turning the air itself into a suffocating blanket. Most people sought shade during these hours, including the overseers, who would gorge themselves on pork and rum until their bellies were heavy and their reflexes dulled. But Isaac Freeman was wide awake, positioned near the forge where he had spent countless hours creating horseshoes under Reuben's vicious supervision. This was the same forge where he had lost 3 fingernails to a red-hot iron rod, punishment for the crime of blinking at the wrong moment. Today that buried fury was finally going to break free. Reuben's routine was as predictable as sunrise. Every day at noon, he would stumble to the forge, claiming he enjoyed the warmth. Today Josie had confirmed that Reuben had consumed his usual portion of Clara's special molasses bread, just enough fermented bitterroot to slow his reactions without raising suspicion. When Reuben staggered through the forge entrance, Isaac was ready. The iron tongs lay within easy reach, their edges filed sharp enough to cut through bone. Ain't you done with that wheel yet, boy? Reuben barked, his words slightly slurred. Isaac continued hammering, each strike ringing out like a funeral bell. He could feel Reuben moving closer, reaching for the chain that hung on the wall, the same chain that had bound so many victims to the whipping post. That's when Isaac struck, moving with fluid grace. The tongs closed around Reuben's throat as Isaac spun him against the wooden post hard enough to rattle his teeth. Before the overseer could draw breath to scream, Isaac pressed the red-hot metal against his ribs, not enough to kill, just enough to give him a taste of the agony he had inflicted. Feel that? Isaac growled, his voice carrying decades of suppressed rage. That's what it felt like when you burned my brother's leg. He was 13 years old. What happened next was methodical, precise, and utterly without mercy. Isaac broke Reuben's fingers one by one, the same fingers that had gripped the whip handle, then the wrist, then the arm. Each snap of bone was accompanied by a whispered name. This is for Thomas. This is for Samuel. This is for Mary's baby. When Reuben finally broke, when the pain stripped away his arrogance and left him begging, Isaac leaned close enough to see his own reflection in the overseer's terrified eyes. We ain't begging anymore, he said simply. The body went into the coal bin, covered with ash and forgotten. By the time anyone came looking, Reuben had simply vanished. That evening, Clara passed Isaac a small piece of cloth, a token, a recognition, a promise that this was only the beginning. One down, she said quietly. But Colonel Horace Whitmore sat on his veranda the next morning, watching steam curl from his chicory coffee like smoke from a funeral pyre. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. Where the hell is Reuben? He demanded, his alcohol-ravaged voice carrying across the plantation grounds. The colonel's first instinct was to make someone pay. He called for Jeb, another overseer whose cruelty was legendary. Find him, Whitmore commanded, or find someone to blame. That afternoon, 3 young men found themselves lined up in the Kaiai plantation yard, their only crime being in the wrong place when a white man needed someone to hurt. Jeb paced in front of the boys like a strutting rooster, savoring their fear. But what Jeb didn't know was that his own death was already planned. That evening, he received his usual coffee laced with bourbon, a tradition Clara had been cultivating for weeks. The glass sliver mixed into the liquid was so small it was invisible, and the bitter root masked any unusual taste until his chest began to tighten and his vision started to blur. When Jeb realized something was wrong, he discovered that the guards were mysteriously absent. They were out searching for Reuben, just as Clara had known they would be. That's when he heard it, a voice from the shadows, soft as a whisper but carrying the weight of divine judgment. Justice don't knock, Colonel. She comes in swinging. Abner emerged from the darkness like an avenging angel, bringing with him the fury of every parent who had watched their child suffer. The mallet that had been used to shoe horses now found a different purpose, connecting with Jeb's kneecap with a sound like a tree branch snapping. As Jeb fell, Isaac appeared, moving with the calm deliberation of a surgeon. There was no passion in what followed, just the methodical destruction of the hands that had beaten, the fingers that had pointed in accusation, the jaw that had spat hatred. This one's for the boy who never did nothing but stand in the sun, Isaac said as he finished his work. By morning, Jeb had joined Reuben in the realm of whispered fears. The plantation continued to function, but something fundamental had changed. The air itself tasted different, charged with electricity that comes before lightning strikes. 2 overseers had vanished without a trace, and in the quarters, 45 people who had been branded as property began to understand that they were something far more dangerous. They were human beings who had remembered their power. Clara knew that bodies leave traces, and traces lead to questions that could destroy them all. Ain't no fire without a grave. We need a place to bury the proof. Behind the smokehouse, past the rusted equipment, lay the old well that had been abandoned when it ran dry. Deep, dark, and completely forgotten, it was perfect for their needs. From that day forward, it would serve as a tomb for those who had made their living through the systematic destruction of human dignity. The third overseer to disappear was Miles. Not the loudest or the most obviously vicious, but in many ways the most dangerous. Miles didn't beat for pleasure, he beat for principle, with the cold efficiency of a machine designed to break human spirits. Every Thursday, Miles would walk the fence line behind the cornrows, always alone, always predictable. Rachel played her part perfectly, limping into view just as Miles reached the most isolated part of his route. Her cries for help were so convincing that Miles actually hesitated, perhaps remembering some distant echo of human compassion. But that hesitation was all Elijah needed to slip the cord around his neck and Isaac to emerge from the shadows with eyes that had seen too much and forgiven nothing. "This one's personal," Isaac said, and Miles's eyes went wide as he realized he was about to pay for every life he had destroyed. They broke him just enough to ensure he understood exactly what was happening and why. And when they finally lowered him into the old well, Isaac made sure he heard every word. "This is where you put Eliza in 1869. She was carrying a child." The sound of Miles hitting the bottom echoed like thunder, but it was quickly muffled by the boards and dirt they used to seal the well forever. 3 down, and in the quarters, people began to walk a little straighter, speak a little louder, and look their remaining oppressors directly in the eye. Colonel Horace Whitmore had always believed he was untouchable, protected by law, by custom, by the simple fact that he owned everything and everyone around him. He sat in his study that evening, polishing a pistol he had never fired, rambling drunkenly to portraits of ancestors who had built their wealth on the same foundation of human misery. When the door creaked open, he didn't even look up. "About time, Jeb," he slurred, assuming it was his missing overseer. "Fetch me another drink." But when he raised his head, he saw Isaac Freeman standing in the doorway, and for the first time in his life, Horace Whitmore understood what it felt like to be completely helpless. Isaac didn't say a word. He simply raised the butt of an old rifle and brought it down with all the force of generations of suppressed rage. When Whitmore awakened, he was no longer in his comfortable study surrounded by symbols of his power. Instead, he found himself tied to the very whipping post where so many had suffered for his profit, surrounded by 47 faces he had never bothered to see as human beings. Clara stepped forward first, her voice carrying quiet authority. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. Whitmore blinked, blood trickling from his split lip. You're just a house girl," he stammered. The slap that followed was so hard it loosened 3 of his teeth. "Try again," Clara said calmly. "You're a damn slave," he screamed, as if the word itself could restore his power. Clara smiled, and in that smile was the promise of everything he had coming to him. "No," she said softly. "I'm the daughter of the woman you sold for 2 goats and a jug of molasses. I'm the sister of the child you ripped from my arms when she was 6 years old. I'm the scream that still echoes through these walls. I'm the nightmare that became real." One by one, they stepped forward to confront the man who had shaped their lives through systematic cruelty. Abner spoke of his father, drowned for refusing to work on Sunday. Rachel told of nursing her own baby only to be burned with hot irons, for stealing milk. Josie showed the scars that covered his young body, marks of lessons that had nothing to do with education, and everything to do with breaking the human spirit. And when they demanded his confession, Whitmore finally broke, not from physical pain, that would come later, but from being forced to see his victims as human beings for the first time. "Yes," he wept, his voice cracking like a child's. "I ordered it, all of it. I owned them. I had the right." Isaac leaned close enough to see his own reflection in the colonel's terrified eyes. "No," he said quietly, "you had power. That ain't the same thing." What followed was not revenge, it was justice, administered by those who had been denied it for their entire lives. They used the same branding iron that had marked their skin, the same chains that had bound their bodies, the same whips that had torn their flesh. And when Colonel Horace Whitmore screamed, the sound was swallowed by the same earth that had absorbed the cries of his victims for decades. The sky turned the color of fresh blood long before the first torch touched the cane. It was as if the very heavens knew what was coming and were preparing to bear witness to something that would echo through history. Isaac stood at the edge of the vast cane field that had been watered with the sweat and blood of his people for generations. In his hand, he held a torch made from cane stalks wrapped in cloth soaked with pig fat. "Every lash, every broken bone, every stolen child," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled group. "All of it was for this moment." Clara stood beside him, her own torch burning like a beacon of justice. "This land has been drinking our blood for too long," she declared. "Tonight, it drinks something else." She stepped forward first, pressing her flame to the base of the dry stalks. The fire caught with an eagerness that seemed almost supernatural, as if it had been waiting its entire existence for this moment of righteous destruction. The cane didn't burn quietly. Each stalk seemed to cry out as it was consumed, popping and hissing like souls finally being released from bondage. The flames danced and twisted, reaching toward the star-filled sky as if trying to touch the faces of all those who had died in these fields. From his position tied to the whipping post, Colonel Whitmore watched his fortune turn to ash and smoke. His screams weren't from physical pain anymore. They were the sounds of a man watching his entire world collapse. But Isaac didn't even glance at him. His attention was focused on the beautiful destruction of everything that had been built on the foundation of human misery. "This ain't revenge," Clara whispered, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. "This is freedom." By dawn, the entire plantation was gone. The cane fields were nothing but blackened earth and scattered ash. The sugar vats stood silent, and cold. The wealth that had been accumulated through generations of suffering had been reduced to smoke and memory in a single night. Every single one of the 47 stood alive and unharmed, as if the fire itself had recognized the justice of their cause and chosen to spare them while consuming everything else. But they knew what would come next. Word would spread. Soldiers would come seeking vengeance. The full weight of the empire would descend on their heads like a hammer. Isaac looked toward the horizon where the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. They had maybe hours before the retaliation began, but for the first time in his life, Isaac Freeman was truly free, and that freedom was worth whatever price they would be asked to pay. The boots arrived within days, polished and precise, carrying soldiers who expected to find cowering field hands ready to submit. Instead, they found ghosts. The 47 had scattered into the swamps and hills with tactical precision, using their knowledge of the land to turn every tree, every gully, every patch of brush into a potential ambush site. The soldiers were fighting an enemy they couldn't predict and couldn't understand. These weren't defeated slaves. These were people who had already lost everything that could be taken and had discovered in that loss a kind of terrible freedom. Elijah led one group through waterways that only locals knew existed. Rachel commanded the high ground where old chapel ruins provided perfect cover. Isaac held the center, where the deepest wells provided fresh water and the thickest trees offered protection. They had turned the entire landscape into a weapon, and they wielded it with the skill of people fighting for something more precious than their own lives. They were fighting for the right to exist as human beings, rather than property. The first squad of 12 soldiers simply vanished. No gunshots, no screams, just empty uniforms found days later, hanging from tree branches like scarecrows. When the second squad came through, their nerves were already frayed. That's when Clara struck, leading a group that moved through the remnants of the cane fields like spirits seeking justice. They used fire as a tactical weapon, creating smoke screens and diversions that made soldiers fire at shadows, while real threats approached from unexpected directions. By the end of the first week, 27 soldiers were dead or missing. The others had begun to desert, swearing they heard impossible things in the night, drums that never stopped beating, voices in unknown languages, the sound of chains breaking where no chains existed. The general in charge paced his tent like a caged animal, studying maps that couldn't explain how a handful of former slaves were systematically destroying a professional military force. "They're just field hands," he muttered. "How are we losing?" But his officers knew better. These weren't slaves anymore. They were something the empire had never encountered. People who had been pushed so far beyond human endurance that they had been transformed into something harder than steel, more dangerous than any weapon ever forged. The hills of Natchez had become a graveyard for the illusion of white supremacy, and the lesson was being written in blood and fire for anyone brave enough to read it. The hills had gone quiet, but not with peace, with the kind of silence that comes before the final act of a tragedy. Of the original 47 who had sworn their oath of vengeance, only 13 remained. The others had fallen not to bullets or bayonets, but to the simple mathematics of warfare. Even the most skilled fighters can't survive indefinitely against overwhelming odds. Isaac Freeman stood at the mouth of the gully that had become their final stronghold, his leg wrapped in strips of boiled cloth and bark. A rifle bullet had punched through his thigh, but he could still walk, still fight, still lead. "They're coming with everything they have left," Elijah reported, his voice carrying weariness. "More dogs, more guns, more soldiers than we can count." Isaac nodded, unsurprised. They had always known it would end this way, not with victory in any conventional sense, but with a statement written in blood and courage that would echo through the ages. Clara moved through the underbrush with fluid grace. The knife in her hand was clean, sharp, and ready. She hadn't spoken much since Rachel fell 3 days earlier, cut down while trying to reach a wounded comrade. "Ain't many of us left," Josie said, his young voice carrying the weight of experiences that should have taken decades to accumulate. Clara looked up from sharpening her blade. "We're enough," she said simply, and in those 2 words was the essence of everything they had fought for. Not numbers, not victory, but the simple affirmation of their right to exist as human beings, capable of choice. That night, as fog rolled in from the river like a burial shroud, the final battle began. The soldiers moved through the mist like blind cattle, weapons raised, eyes straining to see enemies that seemed to materialize from the very air itself. Elias, the ancient prophet who had guided them from the beginning, whispered his final prophecy. "They're walking into judgment, and judgment is coming. From the trees, from the gullies, from positions that should have been impossible to defend." The last of the 47 struck with everything they had left. Elijah swung a tree branch like a club, connecting with skulls with sickening cracks. Josie wielded a broken shovel blade tied to a pole, each thrust guided by memories of friends who would never see another sunrise. Clara didn't just fight. She marked each enemy with strikes that carried names. "For Rachel," she whispered as her knife found its target. "For Mama, for all of us." Isaac entered the battle armed with a torch in one hand and a length of chain in the other, the same chain that had once bound him, now transformed into a weapon of liberation. He fought not for victory, but for memory, to ensure that what they had accomplished would never be forgotten. When the fog finally lifted with the dawn, the cost of freedom was visible in its full magnitude. Elijah lay still under the morning sun, again, his massive frame finally at rest. Josie was gone too. His young life ended before it had truly begun, but his courage ensuring that the story would continue. Clara stood swaying against the gum tree, a wound running from her collarbone to her hip, but her eyes still blazing with the fire that had carried them this far. Isaac, leaning heavily against the trunk that held Rachel's carved name, surveyed the field of bodies that marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. They had won, not the war, not the land, not even their own lives, but something more precious than all of these combined. They had won the right to be remembered as human beings who had chosen their own fate, who had written their own story in letters of fire and blood. Elias approached through the morning mist, his blind eyes somehow seeing more clearly than anyone with perfect vision. "Ain't many left," Isaac whispered. "One is enough," Elias replied. "One is enough to remember. One is enough to tell the story." The fire had long since died, but its echo still reverberated through every tree, every stone, every blade of grass in the hills around Natchez. Isaac Freeman, his body broken but his spirit undefeated, stood where it all began, beside the whipping post that had claimed so many lives. Clara moved slowly through the clearing, her wound bound with strips of cloth torn from a Confederate flag they had found abandoned in the ruins. When she reached Isaac's side, they stood together in silence, two survivors of a war that the history books would never record accurately. "We're still here," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of prophecy. Isaac nodded. "We're still here," he agreed, but they both knew that being alive was only part of their victory. The real triumph lay in what they had proven, that human beings could be pushed to the very edge of existence and still choose dignity over submission, justice over survival, memory over forgetting. "Ain't no one left to write it down proper," Clara said, recognizing that history is written by the victors, and they had lost too much to count as victors in any conventional sense. Isaac turned to her, and for the first time in months, something that might have been a smile touched his lips. "Don't need no paper," he said quietly. "The ground remembers." That night they began the final ritual of their rebellion. With hands that shook from exhaustion, they dug graves for their fallen comrades. They buried Elijah under the old pine where he had loved to sit. They laid Josie next to Rachel beneath the gum tree that had become their monument to resistance. No preacher spoke over the graves because they were their own priests now, sanctified by suffering and made holy by their willingness to die for something greater than themselves. Clara carved names into stones with the tip of a scorched nail, working by firelight until her fingers bled. "Rachel the Flame," she inscribed. "Josie the Scout. Elijah the Hammer." Days passed, then weeks, and slowly the world began to forget. The newspapers printed sanitized versions, a slave uprising crushed, property destroyed, order restored. But forgetting, they discovered, was harder than remembering. Clara began to plant things in the soil that had been watered with so much blood. Not cane, not cotton, but sweet potatoes and peanuts, crops that fed people instead of profit margins. Isaac helped when his wounds allowed, and on his better days he would sit on the ridge and watch the sun move across land that no longer screamed. Sometimes strangers would come, drawn by rumors and whispered stories, looking for the man from the newspapers. "You the one from the papers?" they would ask. "You know what really happened?" Isaac never lied, but he never answered directly either. "Depends what you call justice," he would say, and something in his voice would make them understand that they were standing on ground where history had been made by people whose names would never appear in textbooks. One day, a woman arrived, carrying a baby on her back and a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. She had Clara's eyes, the same fire burning behind them. "My grandmother told me to find you," she said simply. "Said you'd know what this means." She unwrapped the cloth, revealing a rusted iron spike, the same type Isaac had carried on the night everything changed. Isaac took the spike in his weathered hands and wept for the first time since the night they had burned the fields. Not tears of sorrow, but of recognition, the understanding that what they had done would never truly die, as long as there were people willing to remember. That night he lit candles for every name he could remember from the 47 flames, one for each soul who had chosen dignity over submission. Clara found him there as dawn broke, kneeling in the dirt with tears streaming down his scarred cheeks. "They're coming," she said, and at first he thought she meant more soldiers, but when he looked up, he saw her hand resting on her belly and he understood. Life was coming. Hope was coming. "I know," he said, and in those two words was the acceptance of a responsibility that would last longer than his own life. They would have children to tell, grandchildren to teach, generations to inspire with the story of what happened when human beings decided they had had enough. Years flowed past like water over stone. Isaac's hair turned white, his back bent with age, but his eyes never lost their fire. Clara raised her children on stories of courage and sacrifice, teaching them that freedom was not something granted by others, but something claimed by those brave enough to pay its price. The land itself became their monument. Where cane had once grown in endless rows, now food crops flourished. Where the whipping post had stood, wildflowers bloomed every spring in colors too bright for the natural world. Where the old well had swallowed the bodies of oppressors, sweet water bubbled up from depths that had once held only darkness. People said the hills were haunted, and they were right, but not by spirits of the dead. The ghosts ghosts that walked those paths were the echoes of possibility, the whispered promises of what human beings could accomplish when they remembered their power. In his final years, Isaac would sit beneath the gum tree where so many names were carved, watching the sun set over land that bore no resemblance to the hell he had known in his youth. Children played where overseers had once strutted, crops grew where blood had once been spilled, and laughter echoed from places that had known only screams. When Clara found him there on his last evening, peaceful in death as he had never been allowed to be in life, she didn't weep. Instead, she finished, carving his name into the stone he had left incomplete. Isaac Freeman, he remembered. Today, if you know where to look and how to listen, you can still find traces of what happened in those hills. The foundations of the great house lie buried under decades of growth. The old well, sealed and forgotten, still holds its dark secrets. And beneath the gum tree, worn stones still bear the names of 47 people who decided that freedom was worth any price. Local folks will tell you not to walk too far into those woods after dark, not because of supernatural danger, but because the weight of memory can be overwhelming. They say the air grows thick with the presence of all those who died for the simple right to exist as human beings rather than property. But they also say that if you sit quietly by the stream where Clara used to plant her crops, if you listen carefully to the wind through the trees that grew from soil watered with blood and tears, you might hear something that will change you forever. You might hear the sound of chains breaking. You might hear the whisper of names that were never written in any history book, but are carved forever into the heart of the earth itself. You might hear the echo of 47 voices raised in defiant chorus, singing a song of freedom that no amount of forgetting can ever silence. This wasn't just a story about the past. This was a story about what's possible when human beings remember who they really are, when they decide that dignity matters more than comfort, when they choose to write their own ending rather than accept the one written for them by those who would keep them in chains. The fire that burned in Natchez on that June night in 1876 was never really extinguished. It lives on in every act of resistance, every refusal to accept injustice, every moment when someone looks at oppression and says no more. Isaac Freeman and Clara and the 47 didn't just fight for their own freedom. They fought for the freedom of everyone who would come after them, everyone who would need the courage to stand up and demand their right to exist as fully human. Their victory wasn't measured in territory conquered or enemies defeated. Their victory was in the simple fact that they refused to disappear, refused to be forgotten, refused to let their stories be told by anyone other than themselves. And as long as there are people willing to listen, willing to remember, willing to carry their names forward into the future, that victory continues. The chains are broken, the fire still burns, and the earth remembers everything.